circumstances. Yet another set of indictments.
This is something, this is becoming like a skill set. Like in the news business, you say like, oh, I've covered Olympics or I've covered a campaign. Now it's, you know, those of us who've covered 4 indictments. I don't know if 4 is it. We don't know if Donald Trump is among those indicted this evening, but all expectations are that he will be. Do you feel satisfaction in that? You warned the country, essentially, that he was going to try to end democracy, but most of the country didn't believe you.
Well, it's hard to believe. I don't feel any satisfaction. I feel great, you know, just great, profound sadness that we have a former president who has been indicted for so many charges that went right to the heart of whether or not our democracy would survive. And we don't know yet what the charges coming out of Georgia are, but if you stop and think about what the public evidence is, and you've been talking about some of that for the last hour, he set out to defraud the United States of America and the citizens of our nation. He used tactics of harassment, intimidation. He made threats. He and his allies went after state officials, local officials responsible for conducting elections. Now we know they even went into voting machines in order to, you know, determine whether or not those voting machines had somehow been breached when they were the ones actually doing the breaching. So there is a great deal already in the public record. We'll wait to see what the indictments themselves say, because clearly this investigation has been very thorough. But I don't know that anybody should be satisfied. This is a terrible moment for our country to have a former president accused of these terribly important crimes. The only satisfaction may be that the system is working, that all of the efforts by Donald Trump, his allies, and his enablers to try to silence the truth, to try to undermine democracy, have been brought into the light, and justice is being pursued.
One of the things that we've learned by living it in these past few years is that democracy needs the trust of the people.
That's right.
That the system of democracy at its heart is the idea that the people get to decide how we are governed. And if we no longer believe that our will is effectuated through the system, if bad actors tell us falsely that every election is stolen and that the only way an election is trustworthy is if they come out on top of it, then something, it tells you something not just about that person or that moment. It maybe wounds us as a democracy in a way that is hard to repair. What do you think?
Be critically important. But the article you mentioned that I published about the weaponization of loneliness really does, in my view, point to the larger cultural concerns, because the lack of trust, the divisiveness, the undermining of faith in ourselves, in each other, respect for our institutions, the rule of law, all of that has been deliberately inculcated within our body politic. You know, there were trends before. I mean, we have seen how people have become more isolated, less community-oriented, less civically minded. Then we see how social media and technology has certainly accelerated a lot of those trends. But the deliberate effort to divide Americans, to lie to Americans about what was going on literally in front of their own eyes, what happened on January 6th, don't believe what you saw, believe what I tell you. Those are all the hallmarks of authoritarian, dictatorial kinds of leaders. And so this attack on the elections was the most important step in a long line of efforts undertaken to undermine our trust and our belief in a functioning democracy, and our commitment to one person, one vote, our commitment to carrying on elections so that people would be enabled to vote, not obstructed from voting. Everything that we have worked on to try to make this a more perfect union has been in the target of the anti-democratic forces, unfortunately led by a demagogue for 4 years in the White House.
When we were watching Gwen Keys-Fleming and Lawrence speaking just a moment ago about the mandatory minimum prison sentence in Georgia for a RICO conviction, Ms. Keys-Fleming noted, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, and I saw you chuckle. Clearly, we are getting ahead of ourselves, and we are thinking about potential sanctions as a result of any of these trials. Let alone, there's these things getting to trial, there's the question of conviction, there's the question of sentencing. But then there is, at the end of that road, the prospect of the prohibitive favorite for the Republican presidential nomination being in prison. Do we, as a country, have an interest in him not going to prison so that we can still call ourselves a country where leading politicians don't get locked up?
Look, I think that's going to be a much debated issue throughout the country over the next months, because holding him accountable can happen in a number of ways. Prison, obviously, is one of them, but there are other approaches that can be taken. I think one of the important comments that came out of this long day down in Georgia was by the former lieutenant governor when he said, this is a pivot point. The Republican Party needs to move away. Quit being part of a cult, in effect, is what he meant, where you follow someone who lies to you, undermines legitimate processes of government. Move away from him politically. And, trying to get back to politics in the sense that we used to think we had it, despite all of the human frailties that accompanied it, where, you had parties that would sanction and hold accountable their own members. I was on the impeachment inquiry staff. You cannot make up my life, And so back in 1974, when the impeachment by the House Judiciary Committee was voted on, 4 Republicans voted to impeach President Nixon. Then 3 members of the Senate, leading Republican senators, I think it was Barry Goldwater and Howard Baker and I think Hugh Scott, went to see President Nixon and said, this was a bipartisan vote, you need to resign. Well, that's almost impossible to imagine today because of what's happened to the Republican Party, what they've allowed to happen to themselves. So I hope that we won't have accountability just for Donald Trump, and if there are others named in these indictments along with him for their behavior, but we'll also have accountability for a political party that has just thrown in with all of the lies and the divisiveness and the lack of any conscience about what was being done to the country.
In terms of getting out of this and coming out of this crisis stronger, hopefully, for having confronted, I think, very dark prospects in terms of what this means for democracy. It does feel like the Republican Party as a whole is not ready to make that turn. And I'm thinking really about Ron DeSantis as the guy who's running second to Donald Trump in the Republican primary right now. He is promising that there shouldn't be an independent Department of Justice.
Yeah, well, he's promising anything to try to get some attention. It's kind of pathetic, isn't it?
He's also removed 2 elected prosecutors in Florida who were chosen, who were elected, who he stepped in and removed them. Georgia Republicans have given themselves the power to remove elected prosecutors as well, just ahead of Fani Willis making this decision. That law will go into effect about 7 or 8 weeks from now, which will give them that opportunity. It does feel like the idea of law enforcement being used as a tool of partisan politics is something that, with whatever justification, the Republican Party is really embracing and ready to run with or without Trump. That feels like a big step in the wrong direction.
That's yet to be determined, Rachel. That is yet to be determined. I think it is possible that there are many now in the Republican Party who have signed on to that kind of approach to politics, that undermining of democracy, undermining the rule of law. But the shadow of Trump looms so large over all of them. It's really hard to know, once he's off the scene, one way or the other, politically or because of accountability arising out of the various indictments he faces, how whether or not backbone will all of a sudden be regrown, whether conscience will once again be part of the, the Republican Party ethos. We don't know. We hope, because it would be for the good of the country that were to happen. But if it doesn't, the only way we can possibly contest it and defeat it is through the rule of law, as we're seeing with these prosecutors at the federal and now the state level, but also through elections, where we have to defeat those who want to weaponize divisiveness, who want to undermine democratic values and institutions. And that should be, frankly, nonpartisan, not just bipartisan. People should all be saying what the so-called never-Trumpers, the former Republicans who are, now out beating the drums to say you cannot support him and you cannot support the people who support his attitude toward our country.
On the issue of sort of healing and getting better as a country on this, in reading your article in The Atlantic, I feel like I get the diagnosis. You talk about Surgeon General Vivek Murthy having essentially diagnosed this problem of loneliness being a health problem in this country. You describe it as a real political problem as well. And I get, in a very fundamental way, this idea that, atomized, disconnected populations are really primed for extremism. That's part of what makes us vulnerable to the call of strongman leadership and authoritarianism, makes us susceptible to it like any other number of mature democracies around the world. What I don't get is the prescription for how to fix that, and whether that is a prescription that should come from people who want to be political leaders, or whether that's something we need to cure as a culture in some other way. I mean, what's the way out of it?
Well, I think it's cultural, political, and probably economic as well. I think we have to do a much better job of finding ways for people to work together again, work together on community projects, work together through existing organizations, whether it be, civic or religious. I mean, look at the outpouring of help for the people in Maui right now. I mean, that kind of volunteer effort that is so American, so much at the core of who we are when we are at our best. But I also think that we have to do a better job of trying to stand up against the divisiveness and against the constant stream of lies and falsehoods that come out of not just politicians, but also social media and other sources of information. So there's enough work for all of us to do. It's not just political leaders. It's really everybody saying, this country is too precious, too valuable, too important to allow it to continue to be fragmented the way it has been. And rebuilding that sense of trust and community is no easy task. I don't think anybody would argue with how difficult it would be. Valuable, too important to allow it to continue to be fragmented the way it has been. And rebuilding that sense of trust and community is no easy task. I don't think anybody would argue with how difficult it would be. But there are ways of doing it. And let me just say, I don't think Joe Biden gets credit enough for trying to model responsible leadership, just kind of getting up every day, doing the job. The legislative accomplishments that came out of his first year and a half were amazing. We're rebuilding our infrastructure. We're once again investing in clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and so much more. We're trying to, from a legislative perspective, under his leadership, to put back into place some of the things that give people a sense, perhaps, of security and confidence, optimism about the future. And, what more can a leader do? I mean, really, when you come down and think about it, we've got Democratic governors now who are making school lunch free. That's a big deal because, unfortunately, we have a lot of kids who don't get adequate nutrition. And we have Republican governors who are lowering the age of employment so that 13 and 14-year-olds can now be put to work. That is, in a nutshell, kind of where we are. Why wouldn't we want to join hands and support families in a difficult time, and particularly try to give kids more stability to be able to have better choices instead of just ripping away every social support? So this has to happen at all levels of politics, government, but more broadly, society as well.
Joe Biden is overseeing an economy that's had the lowest peacetime unemployment since World War II, lowest levels of poverty, lowest levels of uninsured people uninsured in terms of health insurance ever in the history of the country. And you just said laudatory things about him in terms of the kinds of leadership that he's modeling. And yet, this is where this is going.
I do.
His approval ratings aren't strong, and his prospects for re-election are sort of middling at best. What do you see as the disconnect there?
Look, I think it is true that a lot of people in our country don't even know what he's done. And part of that is they don't get their news from MSNBC. They get their news from social media, if they get any news at all. They don't have the kind of information that would give them confidence in knowing what their government is doing. We have this bizarre situation where bridges are being built and roads are being fixed, and people who didn't vote for the money to do that are claiming credit for it. And how are citizens supposed to make up their minds? So we have a splintered information ecosystem which really works to the disadvantage of somebody who is not a performer in a political theater sense, but is a producer in a political results sense. You know, how long can you talk about infrastructure? It gets boring. Let's change and talk about, Donald Trump or one of these other people who do nothing but give us negative messages, because that is so much more exciting. And at the end of the day, how people get their information is the basis on which they make decisions in a democracy. And we have a very difficult time breaking through that. So I have a lot of sympathy for what the White House goes through every day, trying to, get through to people so that they at least know, look what's been done. You can make your judgment one way or the other, but at least know what we are doing in your community to try to get us better prepared for the future. The United States is the best positioned country in the world for the future. And to think that we have leaders and people in our own country who tear us down, who undermine us, who root against us, even sometimes rooting for our adversaries, is just incredibly difficult to accept. So we have a lot of work to do, and I hope that more people will be willing to kind of take up the burden and try to deal with this sense of divisiveness, loneliness, fragmentation that really gives fertile ground for people like Trump to unfortunately peddle their wares.
Let me just ask you one last question on that point, actually, because this is something that's just feels like a huge political disconnect to me, and I just don't know how to make much sense to it. But we had this weird spectacle during the Women's World Cup, where former President Trump, with all his problems, took time out of his busy schedule and all his pending trials to root against the U.S. women's national team and to single out individual players and sort of call in the, 2 minutes hate against them. He said last week in an apparently unscripted moment that he would much prefer to live in France than to live in the United States.
That could be arranged.
I don't know if France would take him, maybe Belarus. But there is a sense where it is becoming just this increasingly overt, non-ironic thing where he just talks about how much he hates America and how terrible America is. And when you say rooting for America's adversaries, I know you're thinking about, geopolitical consequences, but I'm actually thinking about him rooting against American athletes in international competition.
Well, they were a bunch of pushy women, Rachel. Come on, let's not overlook the fact that they were a women's team who had fought for equal pay, a women's team who were outspoken, who were proud, who were confident, exactly as I have some experience knowing the kind of women that people like Trump hate. And
but to be overtly anti-patriotic on even the most surface level, I mean, that's kind of...
But it's not surface to these people.
Yeah.
This is core. This goes right to who they are and what they believe. It's the dog whistle on race, on misogyny, on everything you can think of that they are against, and increasingly very vocally and publicly against. And it's rooting against Americans among us, the hundreds of millions of us who are different or who have different ideas or are of, a different political perspective. So all of that, but in its whole, it's rooting against America. And that's what I am so, like you, bewildered about, but also I've watched it for, now 7 years. All of the comments about, American presidents, American, leadership, American behavior, contrasted, unfortunately, negatively with behavior from dictators. So when you really look at the whole kind of network of people, organizations, and money that supports the kind of attitudes that Trump and those like him express, it is so anti-American in every way. And that is what shocks me, because people walk around with, flags on, talking about how they support him or one of his wannabe followers. And, there's nothing American about rooting against our own team or, undermining the rule of law, going after people who do nothing but their best to try to run elections. I mean, you just go down the list, and it's a very long list, but at the core of it is a set of beliefs about Americans who are entitled to rule and the rest of us. And the rest of us is a pretty big group, and those entitled to rule who believe that they have, the right race, the right sex, the right political perspectives, all of that. They know they're in a contest with us, and it's time we understood that there's no way forward except by winning and defeating these very anti-American political ideas and values.
Democracy wins, or else.
That's exactly right. And 2024 will be a critical moment in whether or not that happens.
Former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, I really appreciate you being here tonight. I apologize that I had to happen in the